Welcome RC pilots and aviation enthusiasts. My name is Greg, and in this video series I'll be talking about landing, specifically my technique for landing an EDF jet. I've made over 600 successful landings with my Avanti, and it's still flying on the original gear. I made lots of mistakes along the way, and I try to learn something from each of them. But it's easy to let complacency slip in after landings become routine. That complacency can lead to a crash. It happened to me recently while making this video. So it's good to be reminded that every landing is a unique challenge. While that keeps landings interesting and fun, the physics behind them can be unforgiving, as seen here with the albatross. Also known as the Goonie bird, its long, thin wings make it hard to slow down on a calm day. Like this poor fellow, when we have a bad landing, we have to shake it off, swallow our pride, and move on. So, practice really helps, but knowing what is going on during this phase of flight is just as important. I've got my Avanti S 80mm EDF jet pre-flighted and ready to go. But before demonstrating my approach to landing, there are a few topics I need to cover. The most important of these will be mastering slow flight, which is, in my view, the primary skill needed for a successful landing. That's right, we're heading back to ground school. But don't bail out early, because I can't guarantee you'll land safely without these important lessons. This video series will cover my aircraft setup, aerodynamic stalls and recovery, the transition into slow flight, the landing pattern and glide slope, and how to safely navigate the danger zones. We'll end with a final exam over several flights, but don't worry, it will be your opportunity to grade me on how well I demonstrate good landing technique. If you've been flying EDF jets for a while, I hope you'll enjoy this review. You might even find a point worth debating. If you just started flying jets, then I hope you'll find a new tip to improve your landings. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. First in setup is CG, or center of gravity. Your operating manual should provide a good CG location for the maiden flight. For the Avanti, that's between 105 and 110 millimeters, measured from the root of the leading edge. That gives a safe location for the maiden. Once you're comfortable with the plane, however, you'll want to adjust that to give the best flight performance, including landing. With a CG at 125 millimeters on the Avanti, you'll be able to flare at touchdown without using excessive elevator. I'll cover another important advantage later in the video. A good CG ground test is done with a battery in place, ready to fly. On a level surface, gently push the tail down. It should remain on the ground when you let go. Then give the nose a light push. It should return to level with the nose gear on the ground. An easy way to check your CG in flight is to perform a 45-degree upline test. First, be sure the plane is trimmed to fly hands-off, straight and level. Then, from wings level, pull to 45, roll inverted, and let go of the right stick. If the plane arcs down aggressively, you're nose heavy. If the plane climbs, you're tail heavy. If it tracks straight or gently arcs down, the CG is just right. When I did this test with my Avanti at a CG of 125 millimeters, it continued on a 45-degree line, which is perfect. Another setup technique I use is a separate flight mode for landing. My landing mode is on a dedicated mode switch, but you could activate it with gear or flaps. If you do add it to your gear switch, though, don't attempt any aerobatics at takeoff. Once landing mode is activated, a lot happens automatically to reduce pilot workload during the landing phase. First, about 1 millimeter up elevator trim is added over a period of 4 seconds as the plane slows down on the downwind leg. Trimming for slow flight helps me to fly consistent speed on every approach, about 30 knots straight and level with gear down and half flaps, and about 25 knots when descending at 200 feet per minute. Now I only have to correct for deviations, not hunt for the right glide slope. My Avanti has an airspeed sensor, which provides valuable information about stall speeds. Flying straight and level at a weight of 6 pounds 11 ounces with gear and flaps down, it will stall at 15 knots. So 25 knots on final provides a safe margin. Minimum controllable airspeed in landing mode is about 20 knots. Having tested the actual stall speed and gotten consistent results, it doesn't matter how accurate my pitot-static system is in reference to other aircraft. I know exactly how fast I need to be on approach. I also program the radio to warn me anytime I get within 5 knots of the 1G stall speed. The warning makes use of haptic feedback, so it feels like a stick shaker on a full-scale plane. That works as a wake-up call if I let the plane get a little too slow on approach. And yes, it has gone off a few times already. If you don't have these options available to you, I recommend getting very familiar with the slow flight characteristics of your plane and learn to recognize the signs of an impending stall. More on this later. Second, idle thrust is reset to takeoff idle, about 15%, and the thrust curve is flattened near idle for a smoother response, especially near touchdown. This helps prevent ballooning if you need to add some throttle back in to arrest your descent. Third, gyro rates are increased to respond more effectively during slow flight. Fourth, control throws are reduced as shown. For ailerons, the rate is set to 30%, which is plus minus 5 millimeters of throw, and expo is at 20%. Elevator is set to a rate of 50%, which is a throw of plus or minus 10 millimeters, with expo at 30%. And rudder is set to a rate of 60%, which is plus or minus 20 millimeters of throw. Expo for that is 20%. You might be tempted to keep your normal rates and just increase expo for landing. The problem with too much expo is a loss of connection to your plane. By connection, I mean that confidence you get when the plane responds precisely to every input on your radio, as if it were an extension of your fingertips. When that connection gets mushy from too much expo, you may lose confidence in your ability to maintain control. In slow flight, when you're flying close to the critical angle of attack, it's vital that you feel connected to your plane. Now you might wonder why I reduce throws for slow flight, when more control, not less, is needed due to the reduced effectiveness of the control surfaces. It's a valid concern. In fact, the first time I tried it years ago on one of my IMAC planes, it scared the crap out of me. I got myself into trouble on the base leg, and the initial response from the controls seemed inadequate to recover. But there was enough. It was just slower than I was used to. That taught me to fly the landing pattern differently from normal flight. It's not meant for aerobatic maneuvers, which is anything beyond a 30-degree bank angle, shown here on the left. There are exceptions, of course. If you're a 3D pilot and your plane is set up for 3D or vectored thrust, or you're flying a turbine, which can flame out, or you have the discipline to not over-control in a panic, etc., etc., then sure, stick with high rates.
I cannot stress this enough. So many people I know land on low rates. I've said it before. It is categorically wrong.
For the rest of us flying EDFs, we want a predictable approach that will get our plane safely on the ground. That means limiting bank angle to 30 degrees and flying a smooth, stable approach. By reducing control rates, there is a less chance of an accelerated stall or secondary stall. More on this in part 2. There is less over-controlling at a critical phase of flight. The aircraft flies smoother, and the flight path looks better. Low rates force you to be more disciplined in your approach, but it works well as long as you stay ahead of the aircraft. I've made more than 600 successful landings with my Avanti in landing mode and recovered from stalls and upsets just fine, even in gusty crosswinds, even when turbulence made a crash look imminent. We'll take a look at some of those incidents later. If you do add a landing mode to your radio, be sure to add an audible alert to remind you that it's on or that your rates are reduced. I now get repeated warnings if I exceed 40 knots with landing mode still on. Discovering landing mode is accidentally on while your plane is in a dive is never a good thing. Here I am jamming the stick all the way over, but unable to complete a full 360-degree roll before finally pulling out at treetop level. Some optional equipment that can help make landings safer, in addition to an airspeed sensor, is a backup battery in case of BEC failure, a voltage and/or current sensor, and a variometer. For the backup battery, I use a Scorpion Backup Guard 2 with a small 2S LiPo battery. A voltage sensor provides the current state of the batteries on board, and is useful for extended landing practice, so you never have to worry about making another go-around. A variometer is fun for getting altitude readouts and learning to fly precision aerobatics. It also can be useful for finding the ideal altitude to start an approach, and most importantly, provide feedback on vertical speed or rate of descent. That's it for setup. Before we move on to slow flight and the landing pattern, we need to examine one of the biggest dangers in the landing phase, the stall. I'll cover that in part 2. Until then, keep your wings in the air and your troubles on the ground. And oh yeah, grease one on for me.